Hello and welcome to my channel. I know it's not summer, but I'm going to do a summer scene. It's going to be a countryside landscape. I'm going to use oil pastels and a little bit of colored pencil, but I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So the size of the paper is about 9 times 12 inches, and the first thing I'm going to do is divide the scene into two parts of roughly the same size. The top part is maybe a little bit smaller, and that's going to be the sky. I'm going to use a couple of blue oil pastels. I'm going to use this light blue. This is something like a light phthalo blue at the bottom and in the middle, and then on top of that I'm going to layer some middle phthalo blue, which is a little bit darker. And then at the top I'm going to add just a little bit of the darker blue, and then I'm going to blend all of that nicely with my finger. The oil pastels I'm using are the Chinese Jieso oil pastels, which I bought off of Temu. I don't really know their exact names or numbers, but I'm just going to be describing the colors to you as best as I can. So as you can see, they are fairly creamy, and they can be blended pretty well. So I was able to draw the sky and layer the lighter and darker blues, so that I can create a nice gradient from the slightly darker color at the top to the lighter blue color near the horizon. Now I'm starting to draw some clouds, and I'm using a white oil pastel. With these oil pastels, or any oil pastels for that matter, you can work from dark to light, meaning that you can put lighter layers on top of the darker ones, but the colors sometimes get muddied. The way to prevent that is to wait for the oil pastels to harden a little bit, which can take a day or two. They never dry completely, obviously, but I don't really have that much time, so I decided to put in some lighter shapes of clouds on the sky, and I want them to look like scattered clouds, very light scattered clouds. And then I'm going to move on to the lower part of the scene. Now, I forgot to mention that before I started working with oil pastels, I actually primed the paper with some clear gesso. The paper I had here was kind of smooth, and I decided to apply some clear gesso to give it a little bit of tooth. Of course, you gotta wait for the clear gesso to dry and harden, and that way you get a textured surface that will give you a little bit more tooth to work with. You don't have to do that, but generally when I work in oil pastels, I like the paper to have at least a little bit of tooth. Anyway, I'm starting to work on the lower part of the scene, and here we're going to have some fields. I'm going to draw fields on both sides, and here I stopped to soften the appearance or these shapes of clouds, because I didn't really like the way they looked initially. So by softening them like this, they're going to start to look a little bit more realistic, but they also look fairly transparent because a lot of that bluish color is showing through. So if I feel like I need to make them a little bit more three-dimensional, I will have to clean up my white oil pastel and put a little bit more white on top of the light side of the clouds, which is usually going to be the top side. That's going to make them a little bit more three-dimensional, but I don't really have to do that right away. So I just soften them a little bit to make them look a bit more fluffy and a bit more realistic. And now the top part of the scene looks a bit better. So I'm moving on with this dirt road, which is going to be in the middle. When you're drawing countryside landscape, a dirt road can be an interesting element to add to your composition, because you have a shape that kind of leads from foreground all the way to the midground and even the background, and it kind of helps you create a feeling of depth. Now, as for these fields on the left, I mostly use some yellowish colors and a little bit of ochre, and I need to blend that well. Now the reason why I'm using some darker colors is because I want to have a bit of variation in that terrain. I don't want it to look too uniform. So with some of these darker areas, I make it look like maybe there are some dips in that terrain, maybe there are some shadows between the rows of those stalks or stems of the plants in the field. And now on the side of that dirt road, I'm going to add a little bit of grass. So we're going to have like a thin grassy belt right next to the road, separating the field and the road. And right now I'm putting that in with a little bit of this darker green pastel. It's not really a dark green, it's sort of like a mid-tone, but it's slightly yellowish green. And that's going to be a sort of a transition from the dirt road onto the field to the left. I'm trying to imitate some shapes of clumps of grass. We're going to have some of those going down the middle of the road as well. And then for the shadow areas, I'm just using a little bit of black pastel just to give that grass a little bit more depth as well. Working on top of that with a little bit more green and just adding some random details to the path using both the green and a little bit of this light brownish color. Now for the field, I'm going to put in a little bit more of some brownish and reddish tones. This, by the looks of it, is something like burnt sienna, although it looks a little bit lighter. Now on the horizon, I'm going to add some trees or bushes, like maybe rows of trees in the distance. So this is supposed to be something like a countryside scene, reminiscent of some of the Russian realistic painters. And my main goal here will be to show the vastness of that area, that flat area, and to create a feeling of depth and distance as you're looking down the dirt road. I'm just blending a little bit, blending these objects in the distance so that they don't look too detailed because they are far away, and then adding a little bit more variation to the fields, like maybe they are interrupted by some grassy areas or something like that, and then adding some lighter details and darker details here and there to create a little bit more variation in that terrain. And also some light beige details, because I thought that initially the color was a little bit too bright yellow, so I'm trying to make it a bit duller by using some other colors. But the main goal here is to create some variation in value, and also here in the foreground I'm making some slightly more defined strokes to create some lighter shapes. Another technique that I can use here is to use a pointed stick to scratch some of the layers of oil pastel, and that will create some lighter shapes, vertical shapes. You can do this when you're drawing fields like this, or you can use the same technique when you're drawing grass. For example, you draw the some of the lighter greens first, and then you put some darker greens or shadow areas, shadow colors on top, and then you scrape off the lighter shapes of either plants in the field or blades of grass, and that way you can create an effect almost as though you were working from dark to light. The reason why you should sometimes use this approach is because oil pastels, even though they can, like I said, you can work from dark to light, there are limitations to that because there's always a little bit of muddying, and also the shapes that you can create are usually not very clean or very small, so they are kind of clumsy to work with, and they are more suitable for impressionistic drawings or paintings, whatever you want to call them. And that's why you often have to use these tricks in order to achieve a little bit more detail. And another one of those tricks to achieve more detail is simply to use colored pencils in addition to oil pastels. But I'll get to that in a minute. So here I'm continuing to work on the fields to the right, and I'm going to use a similar approach. I'm going to use the same colors, some yellowish colors, some ochre and stuff like that. So that's just another large area here that I need to fill, and I also need to invent some detail there so that it wouldn't look too empty. I am filling all of this in and blending with my finger. I like to blend with my fingers when I work with oil pastel. The way you can minimize the amount of smudging is to switch between fingers depending on which color you're working on, and you can also always wipe or wash your hands, and that way you can minimize the amount of muddying or the amount of mess that you can create when working with oil pastels. But oil pastels are somewhat messy to work with, and that's something that you need to expect. Here in the middle we're going to have a couple of trees. These are a part of the midground, so they're a little bit further away. And I'm drawing them with that same oil pastel that I used for the grass and for the trees in the distance. Now, on top of that, I'm going to use a little bit of black pencil. You know that when I work in colored pencil, or in pastel pencil for that matter, to draw trees, I often just use a combination of two pencils, usually some kind of a green and a black, to create shadow areas. Well, I'm going to do the same thing here. The light is coming from above, but it's also coming more from the right. So the left side is going to be the shadow side, and the bottom side is going to be the shadow side. So I'm going to add some more darker value there. But to draw some of these suggestions of tree trunks and branches, it's better to use a colored pencil rather than to try to do that with an oil pastel, because with an oil pastel it's very difficult. It's very difficult to try to produce such thin lines and such fine details. And also there's some fine textures here, as you can see on those canopies, where I'm trying to imitate the appearance of foliage. You can only really do that with a colored pencil. Now, the colored pencils that I use are Faber-Castell Polychromos oil-based colored pencils, so they go well with these oil pastels. But of course, you don't have to use these, and you don't have to use colored pencils. I just feel like adding a touch of colored pencil here and there to your oil pastel drawings can really improve the appearance of your oil pastel drawings, because you can see how those trees now look very, very detailed. So that's one of the things that you learn you can get away with when you're drawing these landscapes. You can draw most of it in an impressionistic manner, simplifying some of the larger areas, and then you just draw a few interesting details and give them a little bit more contrast and texture and detail, and the whole drawing looks very realistic without you having to put the effort into drawing every single detail. And now I'm moving on to the bottom part of the right side, or the field on the right. So I'm going to do the same thing. Like I said, I'm going to apply a little bit of those yellowish colors with a little bit of ochre here and there, and a touch of brown eventually, or brownish colors, so that I can create variation in that part of the terrain as well. Of course, we have some grass on the side of that dirt path on that side as well, and the grass is there casting a little bit of shadow from right to left. Here on the horizon, on the right side, I'm adding some more groups of trees, the same way that I did on the left. And on top of that, I'm going to go over that with a little bit of bluish color. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I want to imitate the atmospheric effect. I want these distant objects to appear a little bit more bluish. So it's easier for me to do that with a colored pencil. Just I applied the oil pastel first, and then just modify the color slightly by dragging the colored pencil on top of it. So you can see that I'm using colored pencils very sparingly, but the effect they're having is very important. Here I'm using this lighter greenish blue colored pencil to soften the texture of those distant objects, because they can't look detailed, they are far away, and when you're trying to imitate that atmospheric effect, everything that is in the distance needs to be simpler in terms of detail and texture and contrast. Alright, so here I'm creating more variation in the terrain, just creating some suggestions of shadow areas between those stems or stalks or wheat, whatever they are, and then softening them, sometimes with my fingers, sometimes with a tortillon. I'm also throwing in some suggestions of some greenish and some lighter yellowish details here and there, modifying the color of the field so that I can create a little bit more variation. And then as I approach the foreground, I create smaller shapes, smaller lighter shapes, to make it look like some parts of those wheat stalks are sticking out and catching more light from above. And these obviously have to be more defined in the foreground area. I'm also going to add a touch of colored pencil here and there, maybe to get some smaller, better defined shapes, and I use that scratching technique with the pointed stick again. I did all of that to make the foreground look a little bit more detailed. I still haven't finished the sky completely, but here I'm going to position another tree. It's going to have a little bit of shadow under it. That's why the ground is a little bit darker here. And it's going to be a tree, a larger tree or a group of trees that's going to be my foreground interest. I often like to add a foreground interest in my landscape drawings, and sometimes the purpose of these closer objects can be nothing other than to push the other objects back and make them look like they're further away. So basically, by adding a couple of trees here and making them much larger than the trees in the midground, I will create that feeling of distance. I will give more depth to my scene. Here I also employed a little bit of colored pencil for the tree trunks and some of the branches, because these are thinner shapes and it's much more convenient for me to use colored pencil to draw these tiny shapes. And then of course for the foliage, these larger groups of foliage, I'm using an oil pastel. I actually started with a black oil pastel to start with a shadow area, and then I'm putting in a little bit of green, the same green that I used. I like to use a limited number of colors. I only played around with colors on those fields because I wanted to create a little bit more variation and interest there without having to draw every single detail. But for the tree, I can create a texture of foliage rather easily using a combination of green and black. Here I decided to take a short break from drawing that tree and to finish the sky by applying a little bit more white pastel on top of the existing clouds. And this is going to define the light side of these clouds, and it's going to make them look a bit more three-dimensional. So you can see that we have some scattered clouds kind of spreading out and converging onto that middle point, and I softened the lower parts of them to make them a little bit more fluffy and transparent there. And I also added a touch of gray to the shadow area to increase the contrast between the light side and the shadow side of some of these larger clouds, which need to be a little bit better defined. Anyway, I'm back to drawing this tree or this group of trees here in the foreground or closer to the foreground, and as you can see, I'm already establishing a very nice contrast between the light side and the shadow side. Once again, as you can tell from other objects, the light is coming from above and more from the right, which is why I have more shadow at the bottom and to the left. And now I'm using a colored pencil to refine some of the details, add a few more branches and add some more texture. I even add a little bit of this brownish color for some of the branches, but I don't know how visible those will be. And now I cleaned up the black oil pastel, and I decided to put in some stronger, darker marks to deepen some of the shadows and to increase the range of value and to increase the contrast between the lighter parts of that canopy and the darker parts of it. And when I make these marks with black oil pastel, I'm mostly using a stippling technique. Sometimes I drag a little bit, sometimes I use a small circular motion, but most of the time it's kind of like a stippling technique where I try to vary both the size and the shape and the direction of the marks that I'm making, because I don't want to make the foliage look too uniform. You want to have as much randomness and variation as possible in there. So once I'm done with this tree and refine the grass under it, the scene will be pretty much done. I'm going to add a few more greenish details here around the tree, and now I'm putting my signature on the right side. The drawing is finished. Don't forget to check out my other videos, and if you want to see the full-length version of the video, if you want to see more content, if you want to see more references and things like that, you should check out my Patreon. Thanks for watching, and I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye bye.